To the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych Podcast. Bernie Sanders has increasingly gleaned attention as a serious contender for the Democratic nomination to run for the office of President of the United States. Our team has done a cursory examination of Bernie as a part of our debate coverage, but we thought our audience of personality study aficionados might appreciate a more in-depth consideration of Bernie, his personality, some aspects of his personal history, and some speculation as to his viability as a candidate. Ken, the Poli-Psych Team MBTI analyst,
hi, Cindy,
will offer thoughts on Bernie's MBTI type. Don, our Enneagram analyst,
hello, Cindy and Ken,
will consider Bernie's likely Enneagram type. Ken, would you like to begin with a look into Bernie's psyche, referencing the MBTI?
Sure, Cindy, and I use the personality database where basically you have specialists and other interested parties voting on what they think the MBTI profile is for each subject, although it wouldn't be valid, 100% valid, or even close to that if it wasn't a survey done by the actual object of the survey. But nevertheless, there is some general agreement. And I'm looking at the MBTI a little differently today and looking at a little closer to the components. And anyone listening, feel free to take the survey. It's probably the best way to get familiar with the MBTI system. Bernie is the common consensus is that he is an INTJ, and but I'll look at that. I think that what I see first from Bernie is introverted feeling is a very deeply held and substantial contact with values, and getting into his personal history later. After we review the Enneagram, we'll look at how that's expressed itself in his own personal life, and then that would what we see on the outside is an extroverted thinker, and most politicians are forced into their judging function more frequently, just in especially their extroverted judging function. That's primarily what you'll see at a rally and in verbal discourse. Bernie also, I think we have introverted intuition, and again, in Bernie's history, he's had exposure to socialist principles and, dare I say, communist principles, going back, to European history. He is a second-generation European immigrant, and it tended to the scarcity mentality that did predominate. It was very difficult place to earn a living. Not a lot of resources, and quite a bit of fighting between polarities of communism versus authoritarianism, or in the generations before that, basically the serfs and the hierarchy, or the overlords. And in the spacious American expression, we have a little more opportunity for entrepreneurial endeavors, and it's a totally different mindset for most Republicans. Yet there are many Europeans who still cling to that dichotomous, serfs and the overlords, and then the theme becomes, how do we get more resources from the overlords and rebalance the limited resources that we have, so it's a scarcity mentality versus an opportunity mentality. But the INTJ, I think, is reasonably valid. I would say also Bernie is slowly shifting more towards ENTJ. Again, the only difference being the extroverted function is showing up more and more in his life as a politician. And I think that would attract a little more of the militant element in his followers. He has sort of a paramilitary, angry exterior that is different than Donald Trump. Donald Trump also has sometimes a sort of an irascible, extroverted thinking persona as well, but it's tempered by a little bit more of an extroverted feeling tone. But you don't get that with Bernie. It's almost like the get off my lawn anger that comes from a deep well of introverted feeling.
We all know, we've all been told that, right? As children, get off my lawn. I used to be so judgmental about that, but now that I'm an older person myself, it's not quite as out of the question to say that to somebody as it used to seem, or inappropriate. But yeah, Bernie, I can see that what you're saying. He does have that kind of a cold sort of an anger. And Don, did you want to discuss Bernie's Enneagram type?
Yeah, I see Bernie as an Enneagram 1, and I haven't really researched that or gotten feedback from anybody other than Cindy, which we discuss the Enneagram together often about different people and personalities. But yeah, it's common for ones to, what ones are all about is developing ethical systems. And I definitely see Bernie in that light. The other thing that Enneagram 1s are well known for is having anger issues. And that's part of, that kind of goes with the territory of the will triad, the 8, 9, 1. But it's especially notable in the 1. And you can just kind of see that countenance of anger right below the surface that Bernie is pretty well known for. And I think just that vibe gives the people that are the just under the surface angry revolutionary types the sense that Bernie is with them and that they're going to prevail no matter what the cost, the righteous cause of the underdog. That's all kind of Enneagram 1 territory. And I'm kind of giving you the negative side of the Enneagram 1. Of course, ethical systems are a wonderful thing to be about. I just don't personally happen to agree with the Enneagram, with the ethical system that Bernie seems to be operating under. And I certainly don't want to imply that all Enneagram 1s would be of a socialist mindset, but they are about fairness. They do want to help make the world a more fair place. And Bernie's politics is his way of trying to do that. So that's how I see Bernie Sanders in the Enneagram, and he's also really going against the grain with the establishment. So I think there's also the crusader trying to change the system aspect to everything that he does. And that's not to say that all Enneagram 1s are going to be that way. We talked about Hillary being an Enneagram 1, and she's certainly establishment. So there can be important differences that way. But that's how I see Bernie, and Cindy may have a few other thoughts to add.
Well, I am tend to be your news of the weird person. So I am going to mention this strange commercial. When I first saw this video, this One American News Network video, I thought this was a joke. They're calling it "Smell the Burn." That's not officially how the campaign refers to it, but there is what amounts to a perfume commercial that has been made to support the Bernie campaign. And again, I thought this was a joke. So I followed the links that are referred to in the video. And sure enough, it is a real thing. ThePeoplesPerfume.com. And even as I scrolled through that page, I became even more convinced that it wasn't really the Bernie campaign, that this was some kind of a joke that some alternative media person had put together. Although it's very complex joke, and it's actually a nicely designed website. So I clicked on the link from there, and sure enough, it does end you up, lands you on a website where they're asking people to contribute to Bernie Sanders. So evidently, what I'm going to gather from this is that Bernie really wants this, and that his campaign is courting everybody. I mean, this is clearly an appeal to younger people, which, as you both have been mentioning, Bernie already has appeal for younger people, perhaps because he's promising free college educations. But so that was something that this just recently came up. This is a fairly new development, and that's what's in my mind right now about Bernie. So I offer that as food for thought, if not further conversation, which it probably doesn't need.
Be sure that Bernie would have won in 2016, but I guess we'll never know. But he was on path, and at that time, the 2016 Democratic nomination, he did win 23 primaries and caucuses, and approximately, I think, about 43% of the pledged delegates. So it was a close race, but Hillary proved to be better at coin tosses, and I guess things just didn't work out internally. So I see a lot of tension in the Democratic Party reemerging here as well. We have the Biden candidacy, which doesn't seem to have much appeal to the younger generation, but it could possibly be an extension of the establishment Democrat wing trying to maintain power, just as they have tried to maintain power in the White House through the NSC and some of the shenanigans that are going on with the impeachment. But taking Bernie back to his roots, Bernie was born into a working class Jewish family. He was raised in the Brooklyn borough of New York City, and was very early on involved in various social coordinating activities. And he was born in 1941, so is currently 79 years old, and pretty spry for his age. Although he did have a recent heart attack, he seemed to bounce right back. And we certainly wish the best of everybody health-wise. And looking at, as Don was saying, we're pointing towards introverted intuition, which is a Jungian term referring to the deeper themes beneath the sense data. And as I'm an INTJ, I believe, Don, you are
Yes.
INTJ, and Cindy?
INFJ.
So we all have that introverted intuition, and we will plug it into, we're all associated with Judeo-Christian values deeply held, and nevertheless, the introverted intuitive does seek out the deeper theme. And in Bernie's case, it appears to have been conditioned strongly by his rather Spartan childhood. His parents were working class, prosperous in an area where there's a lot of discrimination against Jews at that time, and not able to be firemen or run for any office, or it was very discriminatory, especially in the New York City area. And Bernie's father was a salesperson, I think, selling paint, and so he has this sort of Spartan view of life that. And it does resonate with him, the plight of the working class, and he has a very high level of authenticity in communicating that, as opposed to the sort of the more fashion statement Democrats like the Clintons and the others, who sort of. Liz Warren is a good example too. It comes across as inauthentic, but Bernie is the real deal, and he's very effective he's a very good communicator, but does have this sort of deeper well of introverted theoretical leaning that I would say also resembles Karl Marx. Karl Marx also is regarded as an INTJ. And the underlying theme of communism, again, it's a hidden thematic construct similar to a religious construct, but it's sort of it comes across as the antithesis of that expression, and it's not surprising that it's also an anti-religious expression, because in essence it's a competing introverted intuitive formation, and so it would have to be mutually exclusive with another introverted intuitive expression. And so we have this dichotomy coming up through the small-scale socialism. When it rises to the level of being an international or political force, becomes authoritarian or exclusive of all other religious expression, and that's very commonly seen with in communist countries. In mainstream communist countries, almost always outlaw religion completely. China being a pretty good example right now. Or they establish strictures against its open expression that would compete with the underlying dominant introverted intuitive expression. And now we do see that sort of militant showing up in Bernie's polemic quite a bit, his righteous anger, which comes from that well of introverted feeling and comes out in the form of extroverted thinking, sort of this harsh commander persona. And his tracking through the course of his life went from the urban environment through that cultural metamorphosis where the urban is sort of the hippie movement, the back to nature. He ended up in what they call the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, which is kind of an isolated area to the east of Burlington, agrarian. He was right in 1941, so he would have been in sort of the early phase of the social activism, the anti-war movement, and started to gain traction locally in Burlington, which is in the other side of the state, Vermont, very small state. But it was sort of that crunchy granola East Coast version of New England. The New England Democrat is a very different style than the mainstream moderate Democrat. And that's the theme I think that will come out in this coming election cycle, is the sort of that there's a lot of conflict internally between the sort of the Clintonites and the Bernieites, which will play out, I think, possibly violently if Antifa comes back into play. So with that in mind, what do we think about this Antifa? We have Cindy was going to talk about the Veritas project.
Project Veritas had someone undercover go and be underground in the Bernie campaign, and heard some pretty alarming things that something like cities will burn if Trump is reelected. So yeah, and I'd never until just now I'd never really put that together, that the anger vibe that Bernie has, because he's the leader of these people, kind of spills over onto his entire movement. And we feel like we can kind of function as independent people and individuals, but when we become a part of a group, we really take on the characteristics of the group. And as you were saying that, I'm realizing that it's like a lightning strike. I'm sure you both have realized this before, but that is why this person from the Bernie campaign was speaking this way, because the whole group is probably, I'll use the word infected, and I realize that has a negative connotation, but a group can take on the color of the leader, for good or for ill. But in this case, I think there is potential for this to be a real danger for our country.
Yeah, I agree, Cindy. I think that just the mere fact that it's pretty well known that Bernie Sanders went to the Soviet Union when it was still communist, and wasn't Russia, was the Soviet Union communist, for his honeymoon. And this is deeply rooted. And basically, he is in agreement with that philosophy that most of us Americans consider so totalitarian, but it has always been trendy in the super leftist circles in various metropolitan areas. And of course, Ken gave us a good picture of the Kingdom of Vermont, but there's other pockets too that have long had those sympathies, and that some of the Chicago intelligentsia comes to mind historically. Also in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's the county of Marin, north of San Francisco, as well as San Francisco itself, is known for being quite friendly to the ultra left-wing philosophy. And then, of course, the many people in Hollywood in Southern California, although there are a lot of entrepreneurs there too, and that are more oriented towards capitalism, but the mindset that has been nurtured by Hollywood in Southern California also feeds into that. So I'm also thinking of the famous map of, or maybe famous to some people like me, but the Clinton archipelago, the diagram of the counties that were won by Clinton in the 2016 election that were this not land-wise, they weren't very much of the United States, but population-wise, they're the dense areas, and that's where you get the strongest centers of the ultra left-wing ideology taking hold. And I think what we're entering into now in America is a period where maybe a conflict that was avoided through at the time of the 2016 election comes to the surface. And by conflict, I don't necessarily mean violent conflict, although it certainly could go that way. But I mean this potential for a head-to-head contest between socialism and capitalism as ideologies. Although those terms might not be used, we do have, especially in the high population areas, a strong desire to push for this redistribution of wealth. And I see it as that ideology as being failed historically, and of course many other people that are historically educated and understand conservative principles and limited government and the Constitution see it that way too. But there are a lot of people in America that don't. So this is a test that America needs to go through. I see it as kind of an educational process that we haven't really had, that we probably need to have. And how far down that road we go will depend on whether or not Bernie gets some traction. We shall see.
Say the one dominant theme in Bernie's political life has been populism and definitely an independent mindset about associating with other alliances. You know, having alliances with large corporations. He's basically written that off as a source of campaign funding, and I believe he is officially an independent. And he just follows the ticket on his, in order to be able to run through an election, he affiliates himself with the Democratic Party. But I believe he kept it. He kind of held his tongue during the 2016 election, but I don't think he got over that completely. I don't think, as an introverted feeler, he would at all. That would sit well with him over time. And I think it took him about 2 years, and he officially, the Democratic Party, and is now technically an independent. So we'll see. Still, though, he'll be clinging to. Bernie will be definitely address vectors of dissent in order to anchor his campaign, and that's usually an activist would have to do that. And sometimes the cause is quite appropriate if you have, let's say, civil rights or the Vietnam War, which there were people on both sides of that certainly that had valid opinions, and that had to be worked through politically. But we've reached a point where they're reaching for new issues, and I think I was just listening to a Bernie rally in preparation for this show, and Bernie is definitely hopping on the anti-Trump train naturally as a politician. With the same sort of middle school level epithets and name calling and so on that you would expect. And also attaching himself to the other fashion statement, liberal issues, the gender politics, and some of the other catchphrases and ways of basically vectorizing and splitting the electorate and then attaching to the one side of your target audience, which for him would be the youth vote. And he could prove to be surprisingly strong there, which is something the mainstream Democrats should really keep in mind, that if they do write Bernie off or marginalize him, they'll also cut into their significant portion of their base. We'll go around the table on that as we look ahead to the possibility of, I guess we had talked in the pre-show a little bit about Michelle Obama, and Donald or Cindy will cover that. But in conclusion here, I'd say that that we're headed for a very rough ride from the perspective of just looking at the Democrat Party itself and how it resolves this internal conflict between the populism and the independent nature of the New England branch of the Democrat Party versus the mainstream what we call the deep state. I don't see Bernie as being a deep state player. He may affiliate himself loosely to get through this election cycle, but in his heart of hearts, and he does have one, whether we agree with it or not, he is a legitimate political force to be reckoned with, and he could come out fighting. I think that fire is still within him from the 2016 situation, and so the Bernie factor is not going to go quietly.
Yeah, I agree, Ken. And whether or not that he is able to either run as an independent or capture the Democrat Party, I think is going to intensify the battle with his supporters and the deep state. As I see it, my understanding of the deep state is that they're not really ideology oriented. They're just concerned with maintaining their control system, which is basically corruption at the unseen, very high level. And you have a lot of people that are embedded within the system at the federal level and at local and state levels that are enemies of the left and the right, enemies of both the communist-oriented, and I don't like left and right, so I'll say enemies of those that believe wealth should be redistributed, and enemies of those that believe that government should be as small as possible. And those people that have that turf that they want to hold onto their control of government, that play both parties, that we call the deep state, they are enemies of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So there's a sense in which I think this growing awareness of Americans about the level of corruption in government is going to work in Bernie's favor, because a lot of people that support him either know it or suspect this level of corruption that I believe is going to, that's a growing awareness that's not going to go away, and that will help Bernie.
If people believe what the story the Democrats are selling about President Trump and corruption, I could see what you're saying. I could see Bernie's popularity really catching on. Since Ken mentioned it already, I will touch on the possibility of Biden with Michelle Obama as running mate. And a couple months ago, we did a show about Hunter Biden and considered the Biden family kind of, I won't say in depth, but a little closely. And there are a lot of interesting stories there, and anybody who has been very aware of what has happened with Ukraine understands Joe Biden's involvement and through his son Hunter and other means as well. But because of all that, we, and I think the three of us and a lot of Americans have felt that Joe Biden is not a very likely candidate, that his campaign has been losing steam. He is put in a bad light. However, this, I think, has potential to the fact that he is mentioning Michelle Obama as his potential running mate, I think might catapult him into a much better position to receive the nomination, and because he is possibly, this is such speculation, but he's a weak candidate. We know that. But if there is a secret plan to have Michelle Obama step in at the last minute, which many people have speculated about, this might be the doorway that has been the question of how could that happen. I could see Joe Biden being nominated, having health issues, Michelle Obama's his running mate, and now we're going to have to pass the baton to Michelle Obama. Just, again, speculation. I realize it's out there, but I'm not an INTJ, I'm an INFJ, okay? So I do jump to some pretty strange conclusions at times, and that is a conclusion that I have jumped to.
Well, it certainly is possible, and it would fit what my understanding of the way the Democrats have been playing the game lately, and that is to not let things they don't want vetted have enough time to get vetted. If the plan is to move somebody like Michelle Obama into position to be in the highest office of the land, I think their strategy would be, let's not really let people get to know her. Let's let her maintain those very high favorability ratings that she enjoys from having been First Lady. And whether or not she actually is what people believe she is, well, that would kind of fit their plan, kind of as I see the Barack Obama having done. So the Democrats have experience with this kind of holding your cards very close to your chest until you're ready to play them. And of course, there's a lot of things that haven't come out about Barack Obama yet that we suspect will. So a lot of this strategy, the things that we see unfolding now, I think there are counters to those strategies that, of course, are also hidden until it comes time for the Republican Party to play their hand. And how they play their hand, of course, will be basically Mr. Trump's decision, President Trump's decision. And I do think that he will probably have a counter for virtually everything, because I do believe the guy's a very smart, strategic thinker. And it will be very interesting to see how all of this unfolds.
I have one more little odd thought that I think was triggered by thinking about Bernie in terms of being a one. And I'm thinking about similarities between Bernie's role in the Democrat Party and Ron Paul's role in the Republican Party. Ron Paul also being a one, we believe. And what played out at a few different conventions. There was one convention where Ron Paul wasn't even permitted to speak. And another similarity between the two men is that they have both been independents. And Ken, as you said, it's been fairly easy for Bernie to step in and seek the Democrat nomination. Ron Paul was not given that consideration as a Republican. So I do. Again, I find some similarities there. And based on what happened to Ron Paul, it's just my guess that Bernie will not receive the Democrat nomination. Just my guess.
The introverted feeler as a politician has somewhat of a problem running against the extroverted feeler, and it's the dichotomy there is the introvert versus extrovert, and the introvert has substantial contact with the object, and the extrovert has sufficient contact with many objects. So you can see, I think that's almost self-evident that you can see that you can trade epithets back and forth with those two types. One will say the other one is superficial or just, going along to get along. And then the extroverted feeler will look at the introverted feeler. Well, you're self-centered, you're self-absorbed, or, so you've got that conflict going on. And great observation about Ron Paul. I think that that did play out in the Republican Party, and Ron was very similar. He was technically an outsider, and frankly, I think Donald Trump is also an extraneous force that came into the Republican Party, and I think President Trump Donald Trump, the entrepreneur, was a Democrat for a substantial portion of self-described for a substantial portion of his earlier career. And Bernie is the same. Bernie's, to conclude here, he's an outside, he's a populist, and he's got a following. And I think we'll see how this plays out. The election is still quite a ways away, so Don's point is well taken. A lot can unfold. We still have the Durham investigation, and there are many loose ends kicking around. I don't know if the Biden platform will hold up. And so Michelle may lose her springboard if that situation festers. If, for instance, I guess Rudy Giuliani's been gathering some information that will be coming out. The Democrats' impeachment gambit, they're letting it go full ahead, which I think actually may be the better move. To exhaust it and then make double jeopardy come into play if they tried to do it again. I don't think they would be able to stress the system again to this degree. So we're so far away from the election that I think they're wise to just let it play, even though it's kind of hard to go through. I think Donald Trump is actually under a little stress. I noticed that his last rally on Tuesday was short. It was in 1 hour, which is a little bit short. I think it was the shortest one so far in contemporary history. But that's great, great roundup, and great to share this with you all.
Yeah, I want to chime in on Cindy's observation about the comparison between Ron Paul and Bernie. I agree. In fact, I want to point out that I think we've discussed Ron Paul's Enneagram type before, and we see him as a 1 in a very similar way to the way that Bernie is. So, and I can't help but, because I'm not sure if we've discussed it on the show before, but the Coen Brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? In that movie, that does have all of the Enneagram types very clearly delineated, and the reformer politician who has his own midget, that's the reformer politician is the 1 who is going up against the establishment. And the establishment is the 3, by the way. And so that is actually, the 3 is Donald Trump. And even though Trump is still an outsider by virtue of his being the deep state, he's perceived as being the establishment. So those who are looking for a reformer and don't see the Donald Trump reform in process, because the media is basically hiding that, they will be very much drawn to anybody that says, I'm going to make things right. And that's the role that Bernie is seeking to fill. So, yeah, we'll see how that all plays out. But I think that's pretty interesting that the Enneagram 1 wants to come in there and be the reformer. Definitely see that dynamic, and we'll see how much appeal it has.
So, dear curious seekers and experts, we thank you for joining us for this consideration of Bernie Sanders. We hope that you have enjoyed this time as we have. If you have, we would ask that you please click like for this video, subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on BitChute, follow us on Twitter, and if you have a chance, stop by our website. Once again, thank you for joining us, and until next time, take care.